Good morning. Joe Winberg, Bluebird Semaphore, World History for Ordinary People, and I believe this is edition 18. I was playing the piano, but I decided, let me do some world history. And we're going to continue with East Asia. I will just state, and one of these days I'll display some of what I'm doing. As you know, in the past I did the Silk Road project, bunch of paintings, maybe about 10 or 12. And I put them up here on Bluebird. You can go see them. But I'm doing another called East Asia project. And I have 4 of them done. And I'll be doing more. And like I said, I'll show you some. It's kind of bringing a visual world and a literary world kind of together. Historical world together, hopefully. But anyway, I'm going to start today with Japan, which we've talked about Japan before. And I have said, I believe, repeatedly that going back as far as the 1500s, Japan was doing piracy and shore raiding up and down the Southeast Asia coast, and had been pushing into the islands of Southeast Asia. So war and marine warfare in particular was no stranger to Japan. Very militaristic society. But anyway, the Europeans came, and eventually the Japanese had it up to here with them. And they said, that's it, you're all out of here. And in about, I think in about 1650, they made laws that said no foreigners can come into the country. If you're in, you're expelled, you're out. And it also, these laws also said that nobody could come into the country, including Japanese. So if you were out of the country, you could not get back in. And thus there were a lot of stranded Japanese, and as an example, about 3,000 of them were stranded in the Philippines. And they stayed there, they made a Japanese town, and so on. And this was kind of the thing to do for, I didn't realize that Japan was doing it, but China was certainly doing it. They would have their trading communities all over the Far East, you know. And from there, they would collect the goods and send them back to the motherland and so on. And these people would live their adult careers out there, and then if everything went right and they'd save enough money, they'd come back for their retirement to the home country. But that's another story. The story I wanted to tell is that Japan no longer tolerated foreigners. And although this may seem a draconian type of law to disallow anybody, including their own people, to enter the country, it did result in like 200 years of relative peace and prosperity, which is kind of unusual. It usually doesn't happen. I think Korea had a large multi-century era of peace, and China may have had a couple of a century or so of peace, but it's pretty unusual. The long and the short of it is, though, after 200 years and seeing what the West was doing, Japan decided we're going to be like the West. And the kind of #1 way of going about doing this would be to start educating their young people, the more promising sorts. And they would send them to universities and colleges in various places. And China did the same thing. And although China did it probably 60 years later, Japan got into this act 1850, 1860, 1870 to try to modernize. And they really did. I mean, it's amazing how far they came in such a long time. Ability to build battleships and warplanes, the airplanes that worked, and many other technologies. They learned it from the West, and then they implemented it in a very short time. And like I said, China got on board somewhat later, but China had so much difficulties, so many clashing factions. So they would be on for 3 or 4 years this way, then it would collapse and start up in another way. And in the middle of all this was Sun Yat-sen, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, a very important person in world history. And he was certainly worldly wise, very, very connected with the West, and very connected with his Chinese compatriots too. And he had a platform of I want to see if I can get it. The middle part was nationalism. The last part was something like the welfare of the people. I forget what the first one was, but it's three. Democracy, nationalism, and the concerns of the people. Well, it didn't actually say concerns. It did something, but those three things were essential. And that's what China was trying to build on in the early 20th century, which is not so bad, right? But, you know, warlords and other people who wanted to continue to emulate being an emperor one sway, and then, you know, Chiang Kai-shek gets in the middle of all this with his nationalist Chinese party. And there's lots of warring going on and on and on. Chiang Kai-shek, certainly a darling of many of the upper echelons of China. And seemingly the West kind of took him under their wing too. But eventually he got beat off the mainland, as you probably know, and was banished to Taiwan, then called Formosa. And pretty much at the end of Chiang Kai-shek. But, you know, he's an interesting type, but if you read the history of World War II in China, you'll find out that he was extremely difficult to deal with. Our wonderful General Joe Stilwell, he was appointed Chiang Kai-shek's chief of staff. And that was like probably the worst job you could ever want, because Chiang Kai-shek would not make up his mind. He would not make up his mind. And General Stilwell needed him to make up his mind. He would push him to do that, and he would go around and do some end runs. And by the way, one of the reasons why I love General Joe Stilwell is because he actually, for most of his childhood, grew up in Yonkers, which is right next door to where I grew up in the Bronx. And I spent a lot of time in Yonkers. I kind of like that city. But there he was, Joe Stilwell. The man suffered immense, you know, diseases and setbacks, physical ailments in what he did in the very southwest parts of China and Burma. You know, in the Second World War, the Japanese beat everybody out of Burma, including the Chinese and the British. And Joe Stilwell, once again, was given the job to take, did I say Burma? Yes, the Japs beat them out of Burma. And Joe Stilwell was given a job to get it back, because they needed Burma to get a road open to where the Chinese pretty much had their major military base and political center where Chiang Kai-shek was hanging out, although he would hang out in various places. But they needed to get over the Himalayas and past this part of southeast Himalayan area to get supplies in. The Japs pushed everybody out. Most rugged terrain you can imagine. I mean, it just unbelievable. And some of the stories I've read of attempts to, successful attempts, to not excavate, but to extract the population that was fleeing the Japs. Just heroic beyond belief. beyond belief. And there's one book, and I can't remember the name of it right now, but I believe it has elephants in the title, because elephants played a large part of getting roads open through North Burma down to the sea, which would be the Sea of Bengal, and over to India, which is what they did. And they set up camps in India to train troops, primarily Chinese troops, get a force built up to go back in and open up that Burma Road. Of course, in the meantime, they were flying supplies over the Himalayas. Once again, I have to stress, this is the very southern, eastern tip of the Himalayas. Although, actually, probably not that far from Mount Everest either. So, this is the world of the great wonders of the world, the great natural wonders of the world. The Himalayas, the Brahmaputra, you know, the Ganges, and the deltas of those rivers, the monsoons, the floodings, the Irrawaddy. This is the legend and the historical magic of our history, which anymore I don't sense any sense of historical magic in what's been going on for the last 50 years. But back then, in those days, these were magical places. And all of this was going on. Now, granted, I'm not making out that warfare is great. It's not, okay? But in the midst of the war, there were all these great natural phenomenons. And when you read about what's going on in the war, you read about these great natural phenomenons. You read about the Brahmaputra, you know, and how it curves around and gets squeezed through these tight valleys in the hills of the Himalayas. You read how the Ganges is kind of doing the same thing, but more on the Indian plains, and how they come together to form the delta down there in and around Calcutta and so on. But so I'll wrap this up because I want to make these tapes going forward short. They're easier to upload when they're short. So Stilwell succeeds other people that somebody's Marathas. They go through, they fight tooth and nail, hand and fist through that road to open up that Burma Road. And that was only a group of about 200 men, Morell's Marathas. And they fought. These guys were the baddest troops they could get at the time. They got them, they brought them all together, and they succeeded. You know, these are the stories you want to read if you want to read real heroic adventures in recent times. And at least we can assume that it's accurate. You know, for example, if I'm reading histories from 100 BC or 200 AD, there's no way I could think these are accurate. It's such nonsense. Nobody really knows what's going on. You know, even the inscriptions in the pharaoh's tombs, you know, it's all baloney. Now, don't quote me on that because I'm sure there's some truth in any of that. But, you know, during World War II, we had journalists sent out by the press, and much of that is what really happened. So you're reading it, you can't believe what really happened. That story about you know, extracting the population out of North Burma. I mean, it's unbelievable when you read what these people went through. And the bravery of some of these quote-unquote leaders who had to grab the bull by the horn, tell people how we're going to do it, and then go and do it. Just amazing, absolutely amazing. So they got there, and actually that was the beginning. No, it was a lot of beginning of the ends for the Japanese. I mean, you could say Midway was pretty much the beginning of the end, and so on and so forth. They just dragged it out. Guadalcanal and all these places, they just kept dragging it out. And if they had been smart, they would have said, hey, let's give up because this was wrong. What we decided to do was wrong. Let's just give up. Let's make our peace. The United States will give us all our oil, because they always do, particularly if they can make 6% on it. You know, so they didn't know, and so they got nuked. Terrible, terrible. And it's on them. It's not on Truman. It's on them. And I also recently got a little better feel for Douglas MacArthur, because I always thought he was tremendous. The story of him in the Philippines, the story of him marching north over New Guinea, the islands, hopping up north, always wanted to get back to the Philippines. So he told him, "I will come back." But the story about him in Korea and how he had a falling out. Well, I learned a little, and so I was a little upset with that. I mean, you can't just tell the President of the United States, you know, to bug off. But that's not what he did. First of all, he was very successful in the Korean War. He beat them up bad, beat them up real bad, and he was the commander. It was his deal to do what he did. And you know, most of the underlings around him, and these were multinational underlings, because it was a UN force, where, oh no, you can't do that. You know, he wanted to go out off the east, let's call the east coast of Korea, go north a bit, and then come inland and do an invasion. And it was just below Pyongyang. And they, no, you can't do that. Oh, no, you can't do it. He went in a few days, was done. So he was very successful there. They had some setbacks, but then he decided, hey, I'm going to nuke these guys. That's the part I never knew. I'm just going to nuke these things, these people. That Truman said, well, Truman had gave him medals, praised him. He was the conquering hero, MacArthur. But once he said, I'm going to nuke these people, and I think that's accurate, Truman said, no, you can't do that. You know, it'll be the annihilation of the world. Done. You know, the only thing that'll be left will be that tiny little island, Beamy, whatever it is, in the middle of the Pacific, the one that they go and they nuke now for testing. That would have been the only thing left. But be that as it may, I am going to bring this to a close, and I'll see you next time. Okay? Thank you for listening.